kicking, scratching, and mishandling babies. A former UK nursery worker is now behind bars, convicted of abusing nearly 24 children. Prosecutors say Roksana Lecka targeted infants as young as 10 months old at 2 separate nurseries, and some of the abuse was caught on camera. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kennedi Walker, and I'll walk you through the details. You're watching Law and Crime. 22-year-old Roksana Lecka was trusted to care for infants at a nursery in Twickenham, southwest London. Her job was to watch over them and keep them safe. But instead, babies were going home bruised, scratched, and crying. And according to the Metropolitan Police, the woman behind the pain was Lecka herself. The investigation began in June 2024 after another staff member raised concerns. Detectives reviewed hours of surveillance footage, and they say what they saw was disturbing. Police say Lecka was caught on camera pinching and scratching infants until they cried. On one occasion, kicking a little boy in the face several times, then stepping on his shoulder. In another, pushing babies headfirst on cots. And more than once, police say she was seen vaping just feet away from a baby. Authorities say the abuse happened at 2 nurseries between October of 2023 and June 2024. Investigators also interviewed parents. Many of the infants had visible red marks, bruises, and scratches.
You've been seen on a number of occasions to assault children at Roksana.
This is the moment police told Roksana Lecka she was under arrest, suspected of child cruelty.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah. But Roksana, you are going to be under arrest today, okay? We need to take you to the police station, so that you can be interviewed about it.
During questioning, officers confronted her with the footage.
Picture her mum took when she came home from nursery. None of these injuries were there the day before, so she got those at nursery. What about these big red marks and bruises to her back? Any idea about those?
No comment.
Did you cause those?
No comment.
When I go through and watch the footage, am I going to see you touching her back and grabbing her back?
No comment.
But Lecka refused to engage, answering no comment to every question.
Anything you'd like to say?
No comment.
She was initially released on bail, but a second arrest came after investigators uncovered even more surveillance video showing additional alleged abuse. This time, the charges were far more severe. 12 counts of child cruelty, 12 counts of actual bodily harm, and 1 count of attempting to cause grievous bodily harm with intent. Prosecutors later amending the indictment, raising it to 24 counts of child cruelty against 24 children. The trial lasted 6 weeks. In the end, the jury convicted Lecka on 21 counts. She was acquitted on 3. Detective Inspector Hutchings of the Metropolitan Police's Public Protection Command said, quote, "Despite being given multiple opportunities to do so, Lecka never admitted to her offenses during the course of the investigation or gave any real insight into what caused her to do this. This has added more pain and confusion to the victims' families." Here to break down this story with me is international law attorney David Tafuri. David, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just jump right in. Now that Roksana Lecka has been convicted, what happens next?
Well, she's waiting for sentencing right now, and she will be sentenced. And notably, in the UK, they've recently increased the potential penalty for the crimes that she's been convicted of. And so she could serve up to 14 years in prison, is my understanding. And I think this is partially because this has been a problem in the UK. There's been a lot of concern about mistreatment at schools and nursery care centers like this. It's been the subject of debate in the UK Parliament. It's gotten a lot of attention in the media, and this case has gotten a lot of attention as well.
Yeah, and I mean, 14 years, that's a very long time. She was found guilty on 21 out of the 24 counts. Does that still carry the same legal weight as a full conviction? So even if she was found guilty of 24 out of 24, she most likely was looking at that 14 number?
I think so. I can't say she's looking at that 14 number. Obviously, that 14 years in prison is for the most extreme cases. But this one is a very serious one, especially because there are so many counts that she was found guilty of, and because it involved such young children. And these children were completely defenseless, under 2 years of age, unable to report these crimes on their own. So there's a higher degree of sensitivity with a crime like this, because there's only way you can find out about it is by trying to deduce from the marks or injuries to the children. And in this case, also, they had video footage.
This is a Law and Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, takes just a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on your screen, click the link below, or go to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. And when we look at what she was charged with, why might the jury have acquitted her on those 3 counts?
I'm not sure. I think those 3 counts were at a different nursery center. And so she worked at 2 different nursery centers. And perhaps the evidence was not as good. Perhaps they didn't have the CCTV footage for those. So I'm just guessing here because there wasn't an explanation in the reports I was able to find as to why she was not found guilty on those counts.
Police say she never showed any remorse or admitted any guilt. Could that influence her sentence?
I would think it could. And the little bit of video footage I have seen of her, both when she was being interrogated after she was arrested and also when she was actually arrested at that moment in her home, she didn't seem to show remorse. She denied any of these crimes at first. And I think the lack of remorse is very concerning. And this is a very young woman herself. And we don't know what was happening in her life, but it seems like she may have some mental problems of her own. And but you would have thought she would have been counseled to show more remorse. There were a lot of excuses given by her. She was smoking cannabis. She needed to vape. These aren't good excuses, and they sort of emphasize the fact that she was not remorseful.
Because she is so young, do you think that that will matter during sentencing? Like how you said, she's in her early 20s. So do you think that'll help her in a way? They'll, maybe give her 5, maybe give her, closer to 10 and maybe not the maximum?
I think it could. I mean, she's 22 years old, and some 22-year-olds are very mature. She seems to be a not very mature 22-year-old, and perhaps there'll be some view that she could be rehabilitated, and at this young age there's still time to help her understand what she did wrong with a heavy amount of counseling. Perhaps she can lead a happy life in the future. And so you want to give the chance for rehabilitation, especially given her age.
Since these were young children, though, do the charges carry harsher penalties in general? Like, if per se, comparing a 10-month-old to a 10-year-old, the fact that that was truly an infant that she allegedly caused harm to.
Yeah, I mean, the crime that she's accused of doesn't differentiate. It just relates to abuse to anyone under the age of 16 by anyone over the age of 16. But these are factors that I would think are be taken into account during sentencing. As I mentioned, these are toddlers, babies, and toddlers under the age of 2, completely and utterly defenseless. Obviously, if abuse went too far, their lives could be at risk because they're so vulnerable. And I think that has to be part of the consideration at the time that she is sentenced.
Is there any chance that she could face additional charges if more victims come forward?
I think that's sure. If more victims came forward and there were separate acts, especially if they related, for instance, to her work in previous jobs, if she worked at other previous nursery centers or other schools where there were children and there were new acts that came to light and where there was sufficient evidence, I think she could be charged for that as well, for sure.
Well, let's dive into the evidence and the investigation. How critical was the surveillance video to this case? Because I feel like when I heard about this, it seemed like a pretty open and shut case. I mean, they literally have you on camera.
Yeah, and what's one of the things that's interesting is that's not how they originally found out about this. They originally came to suspect something was going on from the marks and bruises on the children and some of the parents complaining, but that video footage was what enabled them to identify which caregiver was responsible for the abuse. And it, from the descriptions in the reports I read, the video was quite good. They were able to see her pinching the kids, kicking the kids, and engaging other physical abuse of the kids, in addition to her also doing things that also seem neglectful, like vaping very close to the kids.
Yeah, that just sounds horrible. Police say the abuse happened over several months at two different nurseries. So this essentially showed a pattern. How did that hurt her case? The fact that, hey, she was at one job and allegedly did this, went to another job and did the same thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, it shows that this was that she can't just blame it was a certain bad day or bad conditions in one center, that this was typical of her behavior. She carried it on from one job to another job, and who knows how many other jobs she had in the past. She's 22. She may have been working since she was 16 or even younger, babysitting kids in people's homes, working at other nursing centers, perhaps working at summer camps. All of these things are potential things that she may have had in her background that makes sense for someone who's a caregiver to children at the age of 22. And we don't know if this pattern of abuse goes back, very far in her history. And obviously, for any parents that had children in any place that she worked, they would likely have a lot of concern about whether they were exposed to this type of treatment by her as well.
Could the court mandate psychological evaluations or treatment as a part of sentencing?
I think that's the case in the UK, but I don't know UK law as well as US law. But my guess is that whether it's mandated by the court, or it's just something that is available to her as a result of her being incarcerated, I do think that she will likely have the opportunity to get that type of counseling, and she really should seek that out.
Absolutely. And moving on to potential liability, could the nurseries themselves be held legally responsible?
I would think so. Obviously, in the United States, it would be possible to bring a case for negligence, and you would have to establish that the center knew or should have known about this type of abusive treatment by her, and that they failed to supervise her correctly. And I would think that that could be a very successful case, potentially with very high damages, given that you can't really determine what impact that could have on the future of a child who experienced that type of abuse. So I think in the UK as well, there probably are some civil remedies available to the parents if they want to seek them.
Right, especially because it seems like this is a pattern and that she allegedly did this at the last nursery that she was employed at as well. And, I'm just thinking about those poor parents seeing those bruises on their children, just imagining how scared their kids must have been while, going through this alleged torment. How would it look like, if they did want to pursue civil lawsuits against Lecka or the nurseries? I mean, I know we said that maybe the nurseries would say, hey, as soon as they found out, they may have let her go or she was arrested. But still, I mean, someone has to be held responsible for this, right?
That's right. I mean, she's obviously being held responsible as a result of the convictions that she has. But parents may want, more than that. They want, and they may want to make an example of these employers, that they allow this to happen on their watch, under their supervision, that they need to take greater care. I noticed also that the Office of Standards in Education, which is known as Ofsted in the UK, is involved in doing checks and monitoring of centers. And you would wonder, how did these centers where this abuse happened, how did they check out? Were they recently inspected? There should be no notice inspections, and maybe we need more of that in order to avoid this type of tragic consequences in the future.
Is there any legal obligation, though, for nurseries to monitor staff more closely after this? Like, what changes could this case trigger in how nurseries are regulated or supervised? Because, in my opinion, it shocks me how long it took for this to get uncovered. If she was doing this at two different places and two different time periods, and kids are going home with bruises, how did they let it go on for so long? So how could this just bring change?
Well, my understanding is the Office of Standards in Education in the UK evaluates every school and nursery center like these that are at issue in this case, and gives them ratings. And those ratings are available publicly, and parents use those ratings to choose what schools and nurseries to put their kids into. And so, that's one ramification of this. Obviously, every school needs to ensure that they're getting a good rating, and parents, should demand that Ofsted do more of the kind of no notice inspections that would enable them to perhaps identify at least the lack of supervision and lack of standards that would lead to a case like this. We don't know in this case, what these nurseries did in terms of supervising her, whether they had close supervision of her and she just was sneaky and did this when others were not around, or whether this was open and available for anyone who really cared to see it to discover.
Even after a conviction, could Lecka appeal, and on what grounds?
Well, I think there's appeals available to her under the UK system. I don't know what grounds she might argue. That the case seemed to have overwhelming evidence supporting it. From everything I saw, her rights were observed correctly, but of course we don't know everything about how she was investigated and arrested and interrogated. But we do have some of the interrogation video available. My guess is that she doesn't have a very strong basis for appeal, but you never know what her defense lawyers might have developed in the process of defending her case.
Right. But in other similar cases, I mean, how likely is it that an appeal would even be successful in a case with video evidence?
I think that an appeal is only going to be successful if her rights were violated in some way. And there's nothing to suggest in this case that her rights were violated.
If, let's say, hypothetically, the appeal works, it goes through, and they're trying to figure this out, is there any chance that the victim or their families could be called back into court for future proceedings?
Sure, if there was an appeal and it was successful and there had to be a retrial, I would think the parents would perhaps have to come back again.
Before I let you go, if you could just share, what's the public message this conviction sends to caregivers, employers, and parents? And does this case set any kind of legal precedent for future child cruelty cases?
Well, I mean, one thing that this case shows us is that it's really important to evaluate who is taking care of our children, ensure that they're properly trained, that they have proper standards and respect for the vulnerability of children. Again, we don't know everything about this case, but if you look at the video of her when she was first confronted and arrested, and you see some of the video of her when she was in the workplace, it doesn't look like she was the type of person that was responsible. That should have been something that caught people's eye, and we need to be more careful about that. I think the Office of Standards in Education in the UK, which has responsibility for ensuring that schools have the proper standards in place and are protecting children, perhaps needs to do more now for these types of nurseries that are taking care of such small children who have no ability to communicate when they are abused. And so I think that's also one of the things that this case highlights is that perhaps we need to have even more of a focus on those nurseries where the children are so young, they're right at the, right at the point where they are perhaps old enough to suffer abuse, but not old enough to be able to communicate it. And of course, because they're so young and defenseless and vulnerable, if there had been more abuse, if she had been continued to work in these nurseries without this being discovered, she might have ultimately done such harm to one of these children that they could have died or been permanently disfigured or permanently disabled as a result of the physical abuse she was exerting on these children.
Right. And you bring up a great point there just about the damage that she could have caused. I actually found it kind of interesting, and you let me know your thoughts, that none of the charges were attempted murder. If you are constantly allegedly kicking a child, and this is a small child, and they can't fight back, how does that not constitute as attempted murder?
Yeah, I think that obviously was probably something the prosecutors could have tried to charge. But because they have this law, which is right on point, which is, physical or emotional abuse towards someone under the age of 16, and because it has a pretty high, prison term available to the court if the court wants to give her, the highest sentence possible of 14 years in jail, my guess is that the prosecutors didn't need to charge a higher offense. They had really strong evidence for this offense, and they didn't want to kind of risk it and go for an offense that might be harder to prove.
Absolutely. Well, this is a case that we will be following closely. David, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
Lecka will be sentenced at Kingston Crown Court on September 26. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.